Hi there, everybody. This is Bo Liddell from Images by Bolin, and this presentation centers around maximizing the quality of your digital photos. Meant really for those photographers whose goals for their work require the best pixels that can be produced. Um, if you aren't ready to process your own photos, and if you trust your camera to make all the output decisions for you, then this presentation, frankly, just isn't for you. I also want to preface this presentation by stating that every shot we take has a purpose or a goal behind it. And so, depending on what your goals are, for example, to produce a fine art print that could be hung in a gallery, versus displaying a small thumbnail on your Facebook page or in a small print to be placed in your personal photo album. The information in this presentation will either have great utility or it'll be totally useless. Now, by image quality, I'm referring to pixel quality, the quality of the individual pixels and of the tonal information and detail rendered in the image. I'm striving for generally little noise in my shots, unless that's what I'm after for some effect. And I'm after good contrast, excellent vibrancy and saturation, accurate color balance rendition, and sharp detail, unless of course I'm specifically after a blur type effect. Um, and these can be displayed in a gallery. That's what I'm really after, or otherwise reproduced with the highest expectations, potentially in a large print format for a client. Now, none of the information contained herein is new. Most serious photographers are aware of it, and far more knowledgeable folks than I have published on this subject. In fact, my inspiration for presenting this presentation is the direct outgrowth of some of the work published by Bruce Fraser and Jeff Shuey, and parallels Jeff's book called The Digital Negative, which incidentally I highly recommend for anyone who takes quality of their pixels seriously. Anyway, since about 2007 or so, as digital capture has really come into its own and frankly far exceeds the quality of film, I found that many photographers have gotten lulled into a false sense of security with the technology, rather than continually pushing themselves to better the quality of their digital output. Some photographers, it seems, compare the current quality of output with that of film, and often become what I think is too satisfied with the output, rather than asking themselves if it can be better or what they can do to take things up a notch. When I look at my imagery, I'm often challenging myself in terms of how I can achieve the same or similar shot, but to do so with higher image quality destined for reproduction. In other words, I'm not satisfied. That pushes me to excel. I might have to look for a camera with a better sensor, or ask myself what other camera settings, equipment, or exposure approach or technique I can use to improve the quality of my end result. So it's in this spirit of striving to improve that I offer to share some of what I've learned, in hopes that others who value the quality of their digital output will find some utility in their day-to-day photography. So we can't address the topic of image quality without discussing some basics. Obviously, your exposure settings and quality of lens are important, but even more fundamental than that, all things being equal, is the basic file format you have your camera record to. Your camera, even cheap point-and-shoot cameras that don't record images in RAW format, all capture photos initially in this RAW, what I call RAW format. Many point-and-shoots cameras just don't allow you to save the image in RAW. They will only record in JPEG. But if the camera is set to record the image to the JPEG format, or if your camera only records in that format, the onboard processors convert the raw captured data to the JPEG format, and in doing so discards over 90% of the luminosity data. The format your camera records an image to is set in the image quality or quality setting in the menu of your camera. You can set it to record in one or both of these formats, as well as different quality levels within each format. JPEG images, if we just talk about that for a second, are the lowest quality format from a reproduction standpoint. And no matter how you view them, online or in print, that's true. They're recorded in 8 bits, which represents only 256 levels of luminosity or light, also called luminance, and are very compressed, highly degraded compared to raw images. Not only is the levels of luminance lower in JPEG images, but the JPEG compression degrades the quality of the color and influences the ability to make color and exposure corrections post-capture. More on this later with an example. Now, the raw image format records the most information. It's not compressed in any way, and hence it's a much larger file. However, it's also the highest quality image your camera can capture. Raw images come in a variety of proprietary formats and record everything your camera senses upon capture. It's literally the digital equivalent to the slide or film negative. Usually, a raw file is recorded in 12, 14, or 16-bit files, the latter of which includes up to 65,536 levels of luminance. That's a lot. Raw images require post-processing, which isn't difficult and shouldn't be an excuse for not shooting in RAW, especially with today's advanced processing software, and offer considerable headroom to exercise what I consider to be tremendous control of the rendering process to final output, and also is quite forgiving of exposure errors, which all of us, even the best photographers, make, thus enabling a great capability to correct poorly exposed shots. This very feature is why some exposure techniques that I'll talk about actually purposely over or underexpose a scene, and in the end provides benefits in terms of either workflow or in terms of the final image quality. Now, similar to a comparison between JPEG and RAW, as I alluded to earlier, the low, medium, and high setting within a given image file format have concomitant impacts on the image quality, the rendering control, error correction capability, and reproducibility. One unique aspect of digital as compared to the film world is the instant feedback and expedited learning. We all know this. Now, the most powerful piece of information available to you is the luminance histogram, which it provides a frequency distribution of luminosity values in a photo. Some cameras can also display the histogram relative to the color channels that are recorded, and those cameras with live view features enable assessment of the light in a scene prior to even capturing a shot, before you even snap the shutter. The histogram enables you to assess and determine the appropriate exposure for a scene, which is something you could never do in the film days. In those days, you had to guess, use handheld light meters, or rely solely on your experience in exposing a scene. The histogram now will scale from black on the left, or 0 on that x-axis, to white, or 256 on the or 255 on the right. Most, if not all, digital cameras should have the capability of displaying the histogram, although depending on your camera, you might have to look for it by digging through your menu. The graph is in essence based on an 8-bit JPEG format. Thus, it only represents 256 levels of luminosity. As a result, it's not entirely accurate at indicating the level of exposure and the amount of highlight or shadow clipping that has occurred on higher bit, say 12, 14, or 16-bit RAW images. Nevertheless, it still provides a good index to the relative exposure of higher bit images so that you can assess the exposure quality. Now, I'll briefly mention here and discuss more later about a general exposure technique called exposing to the right, or ETTR. That is relevant when capturing digital raw images to maximize image quality. ETTR is most appropriate when dark tones and shadows are abundant in the scene, which usually happens in all but the brightest of scenes. Histograms assist you in ETTR by ensuring you expose for the shadows, but don't wash or otherwise blow out the whites and highlights in the scene, or at least those whites and highlights that you don't want to wash out. The reason why histograms are presented for an 8-bit image as opposed to the full high bit image is that with the higher bit shots there is typically too great a range of luminance levels to easily graph and judge the exposure. Due to the high number of levels involved, the histogram of a high-bit image would be pushed to the left in many cases to accommodate the many thousands, tens of thousands of levels of luminance in the right-hand portion of the histogram. And the exposure as illustrated on the graph would appear or lead you to believe that the exposure is very dark. Now, by using the 8-bit 256 levels of luminance as a relative scale for higher bit images, the levels are compressed and make it easier to view and judge the overall exposure. But it doesn't accurately show whether the extreme tones have been clipped in a high-bit raw image. So this is an example of a balanced exposure, well distributed throughout the x-axis. The graph can be skewed slightly towards the right as in this scene, which is dominated by lighter tones, or skewed to the left when dominated by darker tones, or it could be evenly distributed in a bell-shaped curve when the midtones are the dominant tones in the scene. The point is that the luminance is not stacked or skewed heavily toward either end of the histogram, as opposed to this case where the image is overexposed significantly, where the camera is exposing for the details in the dark tones. Notice the light tones have been compressed significantly and pushed way to the extreme right side of the histogram, and some may well have been clipped or washed out in the process. If this is a JPEG image, you can be assured that significant clipping of the highlights would be taking place. If it's a raw image, there may or may not be clipping, but would certainly be less clipping than if captured in JPEG, highlighting the advantage of capturing in RAW and the significant ability to correct for overexposure errors. Here the cameras underexpose the image by exposing for the highlights and whites in the scene. If shot in a RAW format, much of the shadows can be recovered, but there are much more severe limitations with underexposed photos compared to overexposed photos. In essence, there's very little data on the left half of the graph as compared to the right half, something I'll address now. So exposure in the 21st century. With the advent of digital photography, its exposure is really somewhat different compared to the analog film days, and we need to look at it differently if we're going to maximize image quality and get the most out of what digital capture can provide us. Film and the human eye see light on a logarithmic scale, and so we don't perceive how much light is increased or decreased, just that it's changed. So our eyes adapt to changing levels of light, and we can see much better and more adaptively into the highlights and shadows than film or digital sensors can. Now, digital sensors don't see light adaptively, but instead record light in a linear fashion. So if light doubles, it senses a doubling of the luminance. Half of the levels of light occur in the brightest stop, and half of the remaining levels occur in the next brightest stop, and so on and so forth until you get to the left-hand side of the histogram or scene. So this results in very little luminosity data in the darker tones that I mentioned a minute ago, and also, unfortunately, in higher amounts of noise. In other words, it results in a much lower signal-to-noise ratio. So when correcting underexposed images or brightening very dark tones in some correctly exposed photos, gaps in color and luminosity occur in the dark portions of the image, as that portion of the histogram is in essence uncompressed and stretched during the post-processing process. Now, camera makers haven't accounted for linear capture very well when designing light meters to optimally capture light to produce the best image quality, and thus a photographer really has to understand digital capture to optimize exposure and image quality if quality is the main purpose of taking the photos, at least the main purpose of the output. And the result of all this is that, unlike exposing for film, the best exposure for digital capture, especially when really dark tones and shadows are abundant in the scene, is to expose to the right, as I've already alluded to. So the right half of that histogram, ETTR for short, and you can expose as far as needed. but just short of washing out the white highlights, unless that's what you want to do for certain parts of the highlights. Now, ETTR does require, as has been mentioned, that you shoot in RAW format and thus post-process your images in an image entity program that's capable of handling RAW files. Such as the software that probably came with your camera, as well as third-party applications such as Adobe Lightroom or Camera Raw. So this is just a graphic representation of what I just talked about. The vertical lines represent, or the space between the vertical lines represent one stop of light. And in this particular example, for a 12-bit image with a little over 4,000 levels of luminosity, roughly based on a 7-stop sensor range. So it's similar to many of the earlier crop sensor digital SLRs and maybe some of the better and current point-and-shoot cameras. Now we have even higher bit camera sensors now, as you all know, particularly full-frame sensors with dynamic ranges as much as 11 to 14 exposure equivalents, which is really phenomenal. But this graph still nevertheless will illustrate the concept and realities of digital exposure just the same. So the top graphic shows how we perceive luminance, which is what we do or at least try to replicate to the extent possible when we tone map an image with post-processing software. This is similar to how film records light. It's adaptive and represented on a logarithmic scale. The bottom graphic demonstrates the linear capture process, and that's how your digital sensor captures and records light. It's very different. Notice in particular how few levels of light are recorded in the darkest tones of the luminance range. So if the utmost image quality is important for your goals or purposes, and if you have a scene dominated by dark tones and or need to significantly lighten up the dark regions of a correctly exposed image after capture, then the best in-camera exposure technique is to overexpose the shot some, which pushes the image to the right side of the scale where more levels of luminosity can be allocated to each pixel generated by the photo side of the sensor. And this produces a smoother tonal transition with no tone gaps and little or no digital noise in the blacks and shadows. And so long as the pushed exposure doesn't result in assigning luminance values beyond the maximum value in the range, in other words, clipping the whites or highlights, then the overexposed pixels will be recoverable by pushing the luminance down in those regions of the photo during post-processing. However, again, I emphasize that to take advantage of this technique, you have to absolutely shoot in the raw image format. Shooting in JPEG will do you no good here. So here's a real-world example taken indoors under controlled circumstances of a turkey mount that I have in my den. Now both photos were taken at ISO 100, with the left photo at a balanced exposure of 0 EV and the right one underexposed by about 3 stops. Here the right image has been corrected during post-processing. Now if you have a sharp eye, you're going to note that the left image has a bit more contrast and improved saturation than the one on the right. But basically things look the same, right? Wrong. So here's the same two images blown up. You'll note that they're captured in RAW format and that severe corrections such as that demonstrated in these slides simply wouldn't be possible using a JPEG format. But what we really want to notice here is that the -3 stop underexposed image is not quite as sharp. It's drabber in color. And that the color banding and image noise has degraded it, particularly in the shadow areas of the eye and the mouth. And even more noticeable when you look at the darkest portions of the image, you can really see the degradation, the banding, and the noise. The color and noise banding and splotching, also called posterization, is generated because as the photo is corrected during post-processing, the dark tones are stretched into regions with more luminance levels, and the software has to choose which levels to allocate to the gaps that are created by stretching the luminance. And there's no way to make it a smooth, seamless transition nor to improve sharpness, at least not to the degree that you're going to be able to achieve in capture when you correctly expose an image, or if you're able to overexpose it and improve the luminance values of those dark tonal regions. Now, here I'm going to digress for a little bit and talk about ISO and how that affects image quality. Here I'm comparing a -3 stop exposure for both a 100 and 800 ISO image, and this simply demonstrates what we've all come to realize as photographers, that there's a very negative impact of increasing your ISO on image quality, especially when the shot has been underexposed. It's the amount of degradation as you increase ISO is going to be relative to the quality of your sensor and whether you're using a crop sensor or a full sensor. But regardless, in any given sensor, you increase ISO, no matter what algorithms and processors are in that camera, you are going to increase noise and some of the negative consequences of it every time you increase the ISO. Now this demonstrates the benefits of using exposing to the right, or ETTR techniques. The 100 ISO balanced exposure on the left versus the 400 ISO on the right that's been overexposed by one stop and has subsequently been corrected during post-processing. You can see that the image quality isn't quite as good on the photo on the right. But it's barely apparent, and it's certainly acceptable for reproduction because we've pushed the dark tones to the right side of that histogram to take advantage of the higher levels of luminosity that are available, and then recompress them during post-processing. But there are limits to this ETTR technique relative to increases in your ISO. I've already talked about ISO and how it can negatively influence your shots, or the image quality of your shots. If you increase ISO too much, you just simply get unacceptable tonal variation and exposure in some cases. In other cases, they may be perfectly acceptable, but the detail will not be there. At some point, it'll generate softer detail, and although no doubt it's much better than in the underexposed images, it's still not up to snuff with the properly exposed and lower ISO image. So while ETTR is a fabulous technique and will work better with better image or camera sensors, there certainly are limits to it. You can't go overboard with it. Now, issues associated with image quality and noise are exacerbated to the extreme when increasing exposure beyond 1 second. Here, I'm providing an example of some star photos. This is an example where we're really pushing the technology to the extreme, and it's a growing, it's a genre that's growing in popularity. And when you're using long exposures, they're going to do the same thing that ISO does. They're very similar in terms of generating negative artifacts in your image quality. Notice how severe this underexposure is. Generally, you're going to have dark images when you're taking star photos anyway. This particular one is very definitely underexposed. So with the exception of a few pixels representing the stars in the scene, all the tones are restricted to really the very lowest one stop of light. Now with raw capture, again, we can't do this with JPEG, but with RAW we can still find that there's tremendous information in that lower stop of light. We just couldn't do this with JPEG. But most importantly, you can see as we have opened up this image and the shadows, we're starting to severely degrade the image through color banding and splotching or posterization. And that's because we underexposed it too much. There's just too few levels of luminosity that was recorded to be able to generate a good, clean image. The level of banding and splotching is more noticeable as I further lighten the images in this case. Now, while some camera sensors, especially full-frame 35mm sensors, perform quite well at high ISO and long exposures, image quality will still be worse when using long exposure times, high ISO, and when dealing with a lot of dark tones, regardless of the quality of your camera sensors, as I've already mentioned. It all has to do with the fundamental physical properties and nature of light transmission and capture. So for certain genre such as star photography, getting correct exposure and preventing an underexposure scenario by exposing too far to the left is very important, since you're pushing the technology to the limit and have very little latitude for error corrections. So if we zoom into this shot 100%, we can notice the high amount of noise artifacts, even more, both chromatic and luminance artifacts, as well as a few hot pixels here and there, which are always present and most noticeable in the darkest tones. So these are the types of things we're trying to avoid if at all possible. So, all hail Ra. No, not the Egyptian god. Now, I've already mentioned that the raw image format will provide the best image quality, and the following photos illustrate this quite well, just in case you're still not convinced that it's the way to go when recording your images. And at the same time, I'm going to illustrate some ETTR technique. So to demonstrate the benefits of capturing in RAW and ETTR, I set my camera to simultaneously record the highest quality JPEG and RAW image possible when taking these photos of the large flowered trillium. Here you can see a +5 stop overexposed image of the trillium with the accompanying histogram. I purposely overexposed to achieve ETTR for the raw image, which exposed for the shadows to essentially eliminate any noise or possible banding in the mid and dark tones of the image. Now the blown out highlights are shown in red and represented by the high, thin, gray peak on the far right of the histogram, indicating washed out tones at maximum luminosity value of 256. Now here you can see the equivalent RAW shot recorded simultaneously with the JPEG image. Note that some washing out of the highlights is indicated, but it's much less than the JPEG shot. And also remember, this is indicated from the histogram of the 8-bit JPEG thumbnail that's embedded within the header of the RAW file. The high peak at the right is just shy of the maximum of the scale, but there is a shorter bar about halfway up the y-axis suggesting some blown out whites have occurred. Again though, remember, this is a raw 14-bit file in this case. And because of the relative nature of representing these high bit images with the embedded JPEG thumbnail, we're dealing with over 1600 levels of luminosity in this case. It's very possible, and I've come to expect through experience that very little, if any, whites would be blown out in situations like this. So let's see. Here is the corrected JPEG image, and we've recovered absolutely no tonal detail whatsoever in the areas that were indicated as being washed out by the JPEG histogram. And the peak to the right still appears on the histogram, albeit at a lower luminance value, due to the gamma corrected tone mapping that I've performed. Also note that there's a color cast to this image. Now the saturation isn't ideal, and the color problems are especially prevalent in the yellows of the flower as well as the green leaves. This is a notorious problem with JPEG imagery due to the 8x8-bit compression that occurs when saving the file. Also note the halo artifacts around some of the blown out highlights of the blossom. These are simply unacceptable if you're demanding utmost quality and reproducibility of your imagery. Now let's take a look at the corrected RAW file. Here we've recovered the tonal detail in all of the whites and highlights, including those that the 8-bit histogram indicated were blown out based upon the embedded 8-bit JPEG. And the corrected histogram shows no peaks on the right side of the histogram at all, again indicating there's no clipping of whites. Furthermore, notice the better contrast, the color balance, the truer yellows in this image compared to the corrected JPEG image. Again, here's the corrected JPEG image, here's the RAW file. So this highlights how effective exposing to the right technique can be, and that even when using ETTR techniques to improve image quality, capturing in JPEG is an ill-advised method or approach compared to capturing in RAW. Here's another overexposed shot of this time of a pelican taken at Cabotogama Lake in Voyageurs National Park this past August. This histogram is a little bit deceptive. The shot's overexposed by only 3 stops, even though it appears more overexposed than the previous flower shots. And that's due to the dominance in the scene of a lot of light tones from the rock on the birds. Now, I had moved the exposure correction dial on my camera by mistake, so I didn't purposely overexpose this shot, although I easily could have. And upon seeing this in the LCD display, I thought I had lost the shot. But after having looked at the histogram, as you can see here, in the corrected shot, I knew that the scene had still been contained within the dynamic range of the sensor. And it's equivalent to if I had used ETTR to ensure that the noise had been removed from the darker midtones of the vegetation and the water in the background and the cormorants in the foreground. Here I dropped the exposure slider in Lightroom by about not quite 3 stops, about 2 3/4 stops to achieve the balanced exposure. This example shows just how far you can push the exposure in some circumstances, and in this particular example I was shooting with a crop sensor camera with a lower dynamic range. If I had used a full frame sensor with equivalent focal lengths, I could have pushed the ETTR technique by mistake or on purpose even farther to get this equivalent composition and exposure. So the bottom line is that you should record your imagery in RAW format if possible, for all the reasons discussed thus far. It's a far more forgiving format with much greater headroom to correct mistakes and get the most possible out of an image. Correct exposure is always the best, except for digital capture in RAW when all the desired tonal information is contained within the camera sensor's dynamic range and when image quality for reproduction is of utmost importance. Then the correct exposure is always to expose to the right. At least that's my experience, especially when dark tones and shadows are abundant in the scene. So to obtain the correct balanced exposure requires some familiarity with exposure settings, and I recommend that you use the creative modes such as aperture priority with exposure compensation override, or better yet, use the full manual exposure mode settings on your camera. These modes will enable the greatest control and the best final image quality. So I'm just about finished here, but wanted to provide one last example that I've not had time yet to integrate into my PowerPoint presentation, and will also demonstrate ETTR, ETTL, or exposing to the left techniques, as well as blending multiple exposures in a high dynamic range scene. Okay. So welcome back. To finish this particular presentation, what I've done is launched over into my Lightroom catalog, and what we're showing here is a series of shots that I took in a mesic hardwood forest understory at Crow Wing State Park in central Minnesota back in September. And what we're going to do here is quickly demonstrate these exposure to the right, exposing to the left techniques, as well as a multiple exposure blending. And really this gets back to what your goals are for the photos that you take. Now, with the latest full frame sensors, there are many fine photographers that will tend to take a photo such as this shot right here. Overall, a very underexposed photo, and by looking at the histogram you can see that the luminance data is very heavily stacked to the left. In general, this is something we historically wouldn't normally approach or try to do, and it's certainly not the type of technique I'm necessarily advocating on a routine basis, as I've already discussed earlier. But depending on what your goal is, this may be the best exposure or best approach for a scene like this. So for example, if your goal is only to display the photograph online, maybe a thumbnail on Facebook, or on your web page, or you're only going to reproduce this at a 3.5 by 5 or a 4 by 6 print, you really don't have to have the utmost image quality. And the high dynamic range of most digital sensors, particularly full frame sensors, will enable you to recover almost all of this data. It may look as though we have actually clipped our shadows, but in fact, if we correct it as I've done here in a virtual copy of this same photo, you can see that actually we have not clipped the blacks at all. We've recovered a tremendous amount of information, and it's generally a relatively pleasing photo, notwithstanding the lens flare, although that may be what you might be after in a situation like this. But for a small format reproduction online for the internet or small print output, this may well be perfectly sufficient, in which case a minimalist theory of trying to capture your scene in just one shot rather than doing auto exposure bracketing and multiple image blending, this is a very sufficient approach to capturing this scene. However, if I enlarge this shot, and let's give it a little bit of time here to render, you can see that there is a rather substantial amount of noise. That shouldn't surprise us. I've already covered why this is the case when we have dark tones and underexposed tones. And this is a full frame Canon EOS 5D Mark III, an extremely high quality sensor. So it does well in these low tones, but underexposing, no matter what the quality of the sensor, introduces a lot of noise. You lose color balance, faithfulness, and you also lose some detail. As I zoom back out, I'm going to now zoom into the left-hand portion of this frame, and you can see the color banding and posterization even more. A lot of horizontal banding, and where my cursor is now, you can see some color splotching here, some color splotching with magenta in this down branch. So if my goal is to reproduce this with the best reproductive quality possible, this simply does not cut the mustard. So one option I might have would be to expose to the right. And in this case, let's look at this particular shot where I've overexposed by about 1 2/3 to 2 full stops. Now, if I zoom into some of these same regions and give it a little bit of time here to render, you can see that I have far better color balance, more accuracy at least in color balance, much more detail, and I have essentially no noise in this shot. If I zoom out and back into the other portion that we inspected, again, far superior image quality. These pixels are sufficient for reproduction. There is, as you might have noticed, a rather little bit of diffraction. This image was shot at an f-stop of 20. Depending on your goals, that may not provide sufficient clarity. In other cases, it might. But compared to the underexposed image, this is far superior. However, as you can look or see by looking at the histogram, it looks like we may well have some blown out highlights. Can we recover these? We might be able to. If I try and do that, we'll try recovering them with highlights, maybe bumping down the exposure just a hair and the highlights a little bit further. Now you can see that I still have a spike over here on the far right hand side of the histogram. It's not indicating I have any blown out highlights because I have brought down the exposure, but I still have this peak at a more gray value, so to speak, below pure white. And if I zoom into these regions that I know are blown out, indeed it verifies I've lost a lot of detail here. I can see that with the fringing and the edging. And so this particular exposure would not be the best exposure for a one-shot capture if I don't want any of the sky and the sun to be blown out. And in this case, I don't want that much of the sky blown out. Here I have corrected this image for the foreground and midground and midtones, since it has far better image quality in that portion of in the darker tones of the image than the underexposed version. So I like what's going on here in the middle ground and foreground. I don't like what's going on here up above. So if I look at another exposure that's midway between those two, the first two shots, you can see that compared to the original one I showed you, which is shown here, and in fact if we just highlight both of these and press C, we can compare the two. And so as you can see, the middle exposure, or the one on the right, has far more tonal information and detail in those shadows. If I highlight that image and now you look at the histogram, you can see there is much more luminosity information in that histogram compared to the tonal information in the histogram on this image to the left. And so if I take that middle image and correct it, you can see that I can get a lot of good information out of the shadows. I'm also not blowing out my highlights, which is important. So this is a better exposure if I was trying to capture this scene in just one shot than either of the other two exposures. Ideally, in retrospect, if I had spent another minute, taken another shot that was exposed at maybe +1, I probably would have gotten even a better result without blowing out the highlights. But this is all I have to work with. Now, is this acceptable? Let's see. We'll highlight both of these corrected versions of the two darkest frames and compare those side by side, and then zoom into a portion of these images. Now, as you can see, and as we would expect, as we expose to the right, even just a little bit, even just another half a stop to a stop on this image to the right, we're getting far better color rendition, contrast, and detail. So, it's a sufficient image, but is that good enough? Now, depending on your purpose, the photo on the right here may be exactly what you need, and there is no further need to improve image quality. Again, it all depends upon what your needs are for output. However, I tend to ask myself, what more can I get out of my imagery? How can I take this to another level? Can I improve? Or I assume I must be able to improve. So how can I go about that? Well, in this particular case, since I didn't take another lighter exposure between the lightest exposure and this middle one, but I do have two exposures to work with. And while I don't always try and approach a high dynamic range scene by taking multiple exposures, this happens to be a good example where if I want to salvage this shot and get decent reproducibility out of it, that's exactly what I need to do. So I need to actually go back and look at this shot and this shot and blend them together. So what I have here, opened in Photoshop, is a project where I did just that. I ported over a couple exposures, and my base exposure was the lightest exposure, Then what I did to blend these images together, and granted these are taken on a tripod, I did not need to auto-align the shots, although I could have done that just to be sure that they were aligned. I then applied a color balance adjustment. Now look real carefully at this portion of the image. This is where I was getting ever so slight little bit of lens flaring, even in the light exposure that didn't have quite as much starburst coming through the canopy. So when I apply that, here I'm toggling it on, now it's off, now it's on. You can see I've cooled that flare down so it's not as distracting. The next thing I did with the layer that I had imported, as you can see here, was to use a mask. Here I'm showing the mask that's been applied to this image. There it is off, there it is on. I've masked in that darker exposure to balance the exposure to recover the highlights, particularly that around the sun and where the sky is showing through the leaves. I took that same exposure, adjusted it a little bit further in Lightroom, and ported that second copy into this project to make this adjustment. It was just a little further tweaking of the contrast and clarity around the sun and a portion of the canopy around the sun that was getting a little bled out and too brightened and washed out by the flare coming from the sun poking through the canopy and the branches. After that sun definition treatment, it was a very simple matter of applying a basic mid-tone contrast adjustment to what's known as a luminosity mask. In this case, it happens to be a mid-tone luminosity mask. The lighter portions in this mask are going to reveal the adjustment more. So this particular adjustment, you can see here, I greatly boosted excuse me, I greatly boosted the brightness and increased the overall contrast. And then that got applied through this luminosity mask on a grouped layer, which essentially controls and selects what portion of the basic midtones here are going to actually be applied very specifically to certain tonal regions. And when I enable that adjustment, I ended up with this. This was done to provide a little bit more pop in the foreground vegetation and the leaf vegetation and a little better contrast. This was more consistent with what my eyes actually saw. So again, here's the before, here's the after on that. So this becomes my final image. Okay? And if we go back into Lightroom and compare these, we went from this photo combined with this photo to provide this end result. So here's an example where, in this case, manual blending, and some people may do something similar to this using tone mapping software, although that usually introduces a little more noise. But the bottom line is this is demonstrating how you can utilize the best of digital technology and that it has to offer, and approaching your exposure differently than in the film days by deploying what I call exposing to the right techniques so that you can maximize the image quality in your final output. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.